When you create an HTML web page, you often include client-side validation to check what the user's entered before you submit it to the web server. So for example, if there are any text boxes that the user forgot to enter, or if they entered it incorrectly, you can run some JavaScript in the web page to check it locally before you bother sending it back to the web server. And if there are any errors, you might display a warning triangle or a text message or something like that. Well, that's okay for readers who have normal eyesight, but visually impaired readers wouldn't be able to see the error message. So what we're going to do in this lesson is see how you can enhance the validation mechanism to provide additional information on validation that can be picked up by a screen reader. So the screen reader would announce audibly the error message to the user. The example we've got is called audiblevalidation.html, and the idea is the user has to enter their name and email address in a certain format, and we check for that, and we display an error message in such a way that it can be picked up by a screen reader if we get it wrong. So in the name text box, I have a regular expression. I'll show you the code in a moment. The regular expression says you must enter some text followed by a space followed by some text. In other words, first name and last name. Let's say I get it wrong and I just type in my first name. So my first name is Andy. As soon as I press tab, the onBlur event occurs, and I handle that onBlur event with some JavaScript code. And the JavaScript code compares the text that I've entered against the regular expression, and if it's invalid, it displays the error message you can see there. Each text box could have its own different error message. So it tells me I've got to enter a first name and a last name, so let me do that. When I press tab now, the error message has been satisfied, so now we move on to the email address, and I'll type in an invalid email address here. Okay, that is an invalid email address. I'll press tab. The onBlur event validates the email address, error message occurs. Let's go back in and type in a valid email address now to get rid of the error message. There we go, and I'll press tab now, and this time it's worked okay. So let's see how to do this. Here's the code. I have some styles set up initially. On line 24, I set up a style so that all the required input controls, such as the name and the email address, get displayed in yellow. And then down below, I'm going to take you to the markup. So here we go, on line 87 through to line 111. This is the form. It doesn't actually submit to a web server, but it does allow me to check the user input locally. So we'll take the first text box first. This is the input control for the name. So there are a few important points to pick out here. First of all, we have the standard HTML attribute required, such that when I submit the form, it can check for fields which are required and display error messages if I've missed any out. So that's standard HTML5. And then ARIA also has an attribute called ARIA required. Okay, so that's an indicator for screen readers to check as well that you've entered fields that you should have. Now, in order to specify the format for the field and the error message to display, what I've done here is I've used a new feature in HTML5 called datasets. This is really cool. It allows you to add any attributes you want onto an element as long as you prefix it with data. Okay, so even though data format obviously isn't a standard HTML5 element, because it's prefixed with data, I'm allowed to do it. This is a very powerful extensibility mechanism in HTML. You can add any attributes you want to on any element to contain additional information that's useful in that context. So the format attribute specifies a regular expression, and it says for the name you must enter at least one letter A to Z, followed by a space character, followed by at least one letter again, such as Andy space Olsen. So that's the data format attribute. And then the data error message indicates what to display if that is invalid. You must enter your first name and last name. So that's my name text box. And then I've done the same kind of thing for the email address. For the email text box, that's required as well. Now the data format for an email address is a bit more complicated. I'll just run you through the basics. A valid email address must contain one or more word characters, like Andy, followed by the @ symbol, as in an email address, followed by one or more word characters and dots, because an email address can contain a domain, and a domain can contain lots of characters and lots of dots. The last bit of the regular expression here says your email address must end, the dollar means end, your email address must end with a dot followed by 2 or more letters. Okay, so for example, andyo@olsensoft.co or andyo@olsensoft.co.uk. Those would all be valid email addresses. So that's my regular expression for email addresses in the data format attribute. And then the data error message attribute will display the error message if I get it wrong. You must enter a valid email address. Okay, so we have two input fields for the name and for the email address. And these ones have the ARIA required attribute set to true. So let me show you some script which actually acts on that. So when the window is loaded, this function gets executed, and I've used the HTML5 selector API to find all elements that have an ARIA required attribute set to true. So all elements that have the ARIA required attribute set to true. So in other words, this would give me the name text box and the email address text box. And for each one of those, I handle the onBlur event so I can do some validation as soon as the user tabs out of that control. And this is the function that's going to be called as soon as I tab out of one of those controls, audibly validate field. So let me show you that function. Here it is, on line 41. Now, if an error occurs, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a div element with an ID of alert, which displays the appropriate error message. When the user tabs out of the text box, the first thing I need to do is to erase any previous error message that might have been displayed, because that's out of date now. So that's what I do here. I look for an element whose ID is alert, and if there is such an element, I remove it from the document. So that will get rid of any previous error message. What I then do is to get access to the data format attribute defined on the element. Okay, so if you remember, I'll just remind you, because this is the key point here, we had an attribute called data format. What I'm going to show you now is how you can access those elements in HTML5. What you do is you go onto this control, so this is the text box that we've just lost focus from, and you get the dataset property, and the dataset property is effectively a name value collection. Format was the name of the attribute. Well, actually the attribute is called data format, but this is how you gain access to it. This.dataset.format. So that would be the regular expression for this control. So what we do down here is first of all make sure that that attribute existed, and then we check the value of this text box using regular expressions to compare it against the expected format. Now if that function returns false, it means that the text that we've entered doesn't match the format. In that case, an error message needs to be displayed. So using a similar approach, we get the data error message that was defined on the input control. And here, I create a div element. I set its ID to alert. This allows me to then get it later on and delete it, potentially. The key point in terms of accessibility is we also set its role attribute to be alert. This is an ARIA attribute, role, and when you set it to alert, it indicates to the screen reader that when this element gets added to the document, the screen reader will realize that it's a new alert and it will be audibly announced by the screen reader. So let me just summarize that. If an error occurred, a div will have been created with an ID and a role of alert. We set the div to have the error message that we've just retrieved from the control, and then we append that div into the document. So as soon as we do that, as soon as we add this div into the document, because the div has an ARIA role of alert, the screen reader will realize that the div has been created, and it will announce to the user audibly the error message that's just been added. So with a screen reader, if I made a mistake on the input here, as soon as the alert div appears at the bottom there, the screen reader would say that to the user and make it clear that the user has to correct that text box.